Okay, so on we go today. We're going to move from InDesign into Illustrator. So it picks up, but it again means that you don't forget everything that we learned about Photoshop, and you don't forget everything that we learned about InDesign. It also doesn't mean that you forget to work on your portfolio just because we moved into the next software package. The truth is that Illustrator and InDesign are very, very close. And before Adobe even brought InDesign to the table, people used to do all the layout work in Illustrator. So there's a bunch of crossover between the two programs. I am going to try to show you why Illustrator is valuable over the next couple weeks. So we'll spend a little bit of time with that. We won't spend quite as long with Illustrator initially, because we'll end up going into AutoCAD and then we'll go back to Illustrator because we'll do some work in AutoCAD and I'll show you how to weave back into Illustrator from AutoCAD. So there are distinct advantages. As part of the introduction today, though, I'm going to show only a few slides, maybe 10 slides, and then we'll get into just practice today, because more than anything you need practice to get used to and comfortable with the pen tool in Illustrator. But I want to talk about the difference between vector graphics and raster graphics. And that loosely translates to the difference between Photoshop and, say, Illustrator. InDesign's kind of in the Illustrator category. But it's really the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. And I want to talk about that difference because there is a fundamental difference, and they're used for different things because of that difference. So raster graphics, or Photoshop graphics, essentially an image is made up of a bunch of individual colored squares. And if you zoom in far enough on any of these colored images in any photograph, you'll get to a bunch of those individual colored squares. That's a raster image. Raster graphics are great because you can have an infinite number of colors on an infinite number of little squares. You can have a perfectly smooth gradient from one color to another because of those little squares. So it's great for complex colored objects like a photograph. And it's no surprise that we use it in that context. It's easier to edit wherever there's complex color. So when you think about doing a clone stamp in Photoshop, you're just copying one colored square to another colored square. So it's really easy to do. Fancy effects, drop shadows, and whatever, also easy to apply because you're just altering the color of an individual pixel. Disadvantages are, however, as you zoom in, there gets to a point where the image is blurry. So it doesn't matter how large the raster graphic image is, at some point it will always get blurry. The closer in that it becomes, the blurrier it becomes. Raster file sizes are very large because they're made up of a bunch of individual squares that are all different colors. So if you think about the file has to say all of these squares are this color. So this square is this color, this square is this color. And the more pixels you have, or the more squares you have, the heavier the file is, the bigger the file is. Therefore, it takes a lot more computer power, a lot more computer RAM, a lot more computer memory to hold those files and to process those files. It's not uncommon when you're working with Photoshop to have scratch disks errors because your files just get really big. You could have a couple gig file really easily just in the working process of Photoshop. Doesn't mean the file size eventually is that big, but just working on it can be big. So that can be a pretty big downside. Vector graphics, on the other hand, come from a mathematical definition of a particular shape. So if we think of a square, for example, there are two control points that control a square. There's one corner and there's the opposite corner. And the computer plays basically connect the dots. Draw a straight line up, draw a straight line over, and that becomes the square. If we think of old school math coordinate system, if we had 0, 0 as the origin and we had 2, 2 as the other point, those are the only 2 points we need to define a square. Make sense? So it's a mathematical definition rather than every pixel in this square is red or is a particular color. It's just 2 points, fill everything in between with red. Connect the lines with black. So that makes it so that we can create really scalable images where we can blow them up as big as we want and not have distortion. So you could draw something on the computer really small, and you could end up printing it and putting it on a billboard, and it would end up with no distortions. No blurred edges, nothing. It would still be sharp because it's a mathematical definition of a curve. The file sizes are very small. If we think of a square, if it was a raster image and we had to say every single pixel was a particular color that made up that square, obviously the file size would be big. The alternative in a vector graphic, one coordinate, the other coordinate, fill everything in between with red, that's a really small, compact file size. That makes it easier to work with. It's easier on the computer to work with. The file sizes tend to be smaller. The disadvantages, though, is that vector images are not good for photographs or images with high complexity color. And I think the image that I have here on the right is a particularly good example of this. This one is the raster version. Put an R above it. This one here is the vector version. Same photograph, but do you see how light colors are kind of grouped together? It's almost a painterly effect. That vector graphic lumps colors kind of together into shapes. And we can visually see the difference. There's not nearly the subtlety in the range of colors. It's also not as universal. So pretty much any device we have can open a JPEG. That's a raster graphic. Vector graphic tends to be a little bit more specific. It's an Illustrator file. It's an EPS file. That's a more universal vector graphic file. But you generally need something special to open it. You need some kind of special piece of software to open it. So it's not quite as universal, a little bit less common to work with. So what do we use one type versus the other? Our raster graphics are always going to be for our photographs, our high dynamic range images, background imagery, that sort of thing. Vector graphics, on the other hand, are great for line drawings, things that are to scale, things that we want to be able to enlarge and adjust scale on, architectural drawings, design drawings of any kind, those all fall into this vector graphics. Logos, let's say we're Apple and we create our little Apple logo. Well, it needs to go really small in some places, and it needs to be blown up giant on a billboard. If it was a raster graphic, we wouldn't want the edges pixelated. That wouldn't look good. So a logo is a very good place for a vector graphic. You've all used vector graphics extensively with fonts. We talked and we did a whole lecture on typography. When you change the font size, do the edges of the fonts get blurry? No, they just get bigger. So fonts are vector graphics. They allow us to scale without blurry edges. So some examples here. This on the left here is just showing you that a document might consist of multiple types. So up here we've got our logo. That's a vector graphic. Then we have a bitmap image, which could be a JPEG. And they're merged together into the same type of graphic. Down here is the font. That's a vector. So they end up weaving together long term. But let's look at this logo right here. So that logo at a small resolution in vector graphics is 36 kilobytes. Not a big file at all. In bitmap size, it's only 57 kilobytes. It's more, but it's not that much more. It's not that big of a deal. You know, 36 kilobytes versus 57, yeah, it's not a little under double. If we up the file size, though, if we go to this next file size, guess what? The vector size stays exactly the same, but that bitmap size gets a whole lot bigger. More than 10 times bigger. And if we up the resolution again, vector size stays exactly the same, and this went to 2 megabytes. So you can see how that ballooning effect, the larger these images are. Another thing, so same logo. If we stay in vector format, we zoom in to 1600%, we can see how sharp that little tip of the wing is. If we rasterize the image, if we make it a bunch of pixels, and we zoom in to 1600%, that edge is blurry. That's what I'm talking about. It's pixelated into those squares. So that's the big fundamental difference. So where are we going to be using? What programs belong in what category? You can probably figure this out yourself. Raster images or raster programs are things like Photoshop, things like V-Ray that create rendered images. Vector graphics, on the other hand, are things like Illustrator, InDesign, AutoCAD, Vectorworks, Rhino, Revit, all those design software packages that we use, SketchUp. Those are all vector graphics programs. So we can scale, and it's defined mathematically. OK, so we're going to switch over into your introduction to Illustrator. We're going to concentrate today on the pen tool and really getting a good grasp of the pen tool. If you don't take anything else away from Illustrator, just understanding how the pen tool works is absolutely kind of the essential skill that's built into Illustrator. And it will help you both in Illustrator but also in InDesign when you start to create anything that is custom. Some of you already used it a little bit, but we're going to investigate it a little bit more today. So bear with me while I switch over. OK, so thanks for hanging tight while I got over to the other computer. Today we're going to be working in Illustrator, as I said. I will go through and do our traditional walkthrough of the software in just a second. But while I'm doing that, if you guys would go to today's exercise. So I'll go to today's exercise here. Under 113, there we go. And at the bottom of 113, I have an Illustrator template for exercise 113. I'd like you guys to download that. This is designed to help you out a little bit. It's in my downloads folder right now. I'm going to go ahead and open up Adobe Illustrator, and then we'll talk through Illustrator. OK, and actually I'm going to go ahead and open that file. So let me jump back over, and I'll just click on the file, and it will go ahead and open. And let's go ahead and talk a little bit through what's going on in the world of Illustrator. When we first open Illustrator, it should look almost exactly the same as InDesign. So Photoshop's slightly different, but Illustrator and InDesign are very much hand in hand. And the setup is quite similar. We have our file menu across the top here, which is standard. Going down the left side are our tools that we're going to be working with. Notice in the color section here, we have a outline or a stroke color and also a fill color. We're going to be working the same way we did in InDesign. And you can actually tell the difference between a vector graphics program and a raster graphics program, because Illustrator and InDesign, both being vector graphics, we have a stroke and a fill versus a foreground and a background color, where it's just a pixel color. So anyway, we'll get to these tools in just a second. The rulers are shown by default. On the right side here, we have our properties, which include our document properties, rulers, guides, snap options, etc. We also have a tab for layers, which we're going to work with today as we control the layers. I'll come back to layers in just a second. And then we can ignore the libraries section here as well. Up at the top of the screen here, there is something called Essentials. This little drop-down menu can change our workspace. And frequently, people change into other types of workspaces. It's up to you. We can stick with the Essentials. For me, the Essentials Classic is a little bit more normal because I have my regular tool sets with my stroke width and that sort of thing. I prefer this one. That's a personal preference. If you want to work in one of the others, you can stick with that. Any of them are pretty much fine for what we're doing today. But I think I would recommend the Essentials Classic. But again, that's a personal preference. So what we're going to be working on today is fundamentally the pen tool and learning how to work with the pen tool and to draw with the pen tool. And the thing about the pen tool is it takes a lot of practice to get good at it. And the more time you spend with it, the easier it becomes. And so for somebody like me that's worked in Illustrator for a long time, I can pick up the pen tool and I can draw shapes and pretty much have them look the way I want them to look. For you guys that are just starting out, when you first start drawing, often the shapes don't look the way you want, and it takes a lot of editing and manipulation. So my goal today is to kind of work you through the strategies for how you would work with the pen tool, how you work with lines, how you create the shapes in the first place. So in this particular example, there's a background template for the alphabet. We're going to draw all the letters of the alphabet. And I picked the letters of the alphabet because it's a great way of learning to draw. And there's a lot of complexity there. There's a lot of simple letters, and there's some really complicated hard letters, like the letter S is really difficult. And so by the time you get to that letter, hopefully you've had a little bit more practice. We're going to spend the whole day working on this. if you breeze through it and get your capital letters and your lowercase letters, you can actually create your own custom font using this website, the calligrapher.com website. It's not required that you do that. All that I care about is that you're practicing with the pen tool. That's the important thing today. So if you just finished the capital letters, that's okay with me. If you finish the capital letters and the lowercase letters, great. The more practice you have, the better off you will be. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that Layers menu, which is right here. Again, I'm in the Essentials Classic, so I've come down. It's the 2 stacked diamonds. That's my layers. And I have several different layers showing. I'm going to turn off, let me see here. OK, I want to start with, I've turned everything off except for page 1 here. This is going to give me the uppercase letters. I'm going to start with the uppercase letters. I think those are the easiest letters to get started with. So I'm going to make sure that my page 1 is turned on. I'm going to turn my guides on. I put these in here for you so you have an idea of where your baseline is, your X height is, where your cap height should be, etc. If you want to change and edit those, it's OK. This is just a place to start. And the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on this layer here that's called Font Page 1. And I'm going to click on it so that it's highlighted in that kind of bluish color. That's going to be the layer that I'm going to draw on. And you can actually see if you're on the wrong layer, for example, when you go to start drawing with the pen tool, you'll get a little slash next to your cursor that says you can't draw. It's because you're not on the correct layer. So I want to be on the Font Page 1 layer. That's highlighted in blue. And now I'll actually be able to start my drawing. So once I'm on that layer, I have my page 1 on, my guides on, my Font Page 1 on. It's highlighted in blue. I can kind of minimize that layers palette. And I'm going to select on the left side here the pen tool. It looks kind of like an old-fashioned ink pen. It's the 5th icon down right there. I'm going to zoom in, and I'll do that by pressing Control+ a couple times. I'll then hold down spacebar to pan, and I'll click and drag so that I can start with the letter A. So I'm right here at the letter A. This is where I'm going to start by drawing my A here. So there's some strategy involved when you're starting to draw the letters. If I start at the top and I draw down, I have to come back, I have to stop drawing, come back to the top, and draw down again. So while in practice, like if we were drawing by hand, we would typically draw from the top down to create our A. In this scenario, sometimes it's actually easier to draw from the bottom up. So I could start at my baseline right there, draw up to my cap height, which would be right there, and then I could draw back down to my baseline right there. When I'm done, I'll click the black arrow to finish. I could also press the Escape key on the keyboard. And I'll come back to my pen tool again, which, by the way, is pressing P on the keyboard. And I want to draw the cross of the A. And I could choose where I want it to go. It could be high, it could be low. Again, this is a style decision. So I'm going to go close to but not on top of my path, about like that, and finish. This didn't quite connect all the way over, so I'll come back and I want to edit that particular point. Instead of using the black arrow, I'm going to come back and use the white arrow, which is called the Direct Select tool. That allows me to select control points of a line. And when I do that, I can click on the end of this line and have control of just the end of that line. And at that point, I can move it over to the line itself. So you guys are probably asking, why didn't I just start on the line itself? So if I was drawing, let me do it again here. And I drew my A like that. And then I went to cross. See how when I'm on my line here, it gives me a little plus sign next to my cursor? It's actually going to create a control point on my line for me rather than let me start a new line. So instead, I just went close to, but not on top of, my line and came over. And on this direction, after I've already started my line, I can actually snap to the line and end on the line itself. And then I would come back with my direct select tool. I would modify this and pull it over, in which case it'll snap to that line as well. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one and delete it. I'll come back to my first letter here. Now, a couple things about my first letter. One, it's not very thick. Right, the lines itself, the stroke is not very thick. So I can change that. I'm going to use the black arrow, the regular selection tool. I'll select my object here, and I will change over on the stroke menu. It's the 3 lines here. I'll change the weight so that it becomes a little bit thicker. So maybe 6 point, 7 point, something like that. I have more options than just the weight. If I want to show those options, I can click the little icon with 4 lines there and say Show Options. Gives me all my options. And I want to show you what some of these options mean. So I have my first option here is just the weight. So that's the thickness of a given line. The second option is how does the line end? So do I want the ends, right now they're square, do I want them to be rounded? In which case I can click on to round the ends. And the bottoms of my lines end up rounded. Furthermore, see how the top comes to a point there? If I wanted to change my corner to be rounded, I could round off the corner. I could also clip the corner. So it comes up, goes across straight, and goes back down. So those are 3 different options for how to adjust and change the corner. And so again, those are strategies. One of the things that I frequently get asked is, what if, see how these lines end on a diagonal? What if I want those lines to end flat? This is not something that's particularly easy in Illustrator. I would pick this option here to extend them beyond my baseline, and then I would end up having to create a white rectangle to cover up those bottoms. Right now it has a stroke. Let me take the stroke to be transparent, like that. And that would actually create the bottoms. So it's less than ideal in this scenario for how you address the bottoms. But I figured I'd show you that because that's a frequently asked question. Anyway, this line here has not been addressed just yet. So in that scenario, I would come back and I would change the thickness of that line as well. And maybe that one's a little bit thinner than the other ones. Again, that's a style decision ultimately. So let me press Control- so we can zoom out. And I've created my first letter of the alphabet. I'm going to hold down spacebar and then click and drag over so that I can get to the next letter, which I will do the letter E. Again, it's a series of straight lines, so it makes it a little bit easier. I'll come back to the pen tool, and I'll start up here at the top. There we go. I'll come over. I'll come down. Oops, sorry, it should be to the baseline here. And I'll come back over. It's possible that I made these a little bit too far. Remember, I can always come back to my direct select tool, my white arrow, and I can select and move that point so that it's a little bit shorter. Likewise, I can move that point so that it's a little bit shorter as well. And then I can come back to my pen tool, and I can draw the next little, the crossbar for this. So I could say maybe from here over to there. And again, I started on the right and came over to where I touched the line rather than trying to click on the line itself to create this. If I want this letter to get thicker, I can select them all. I'm using the regular selection tool, and I could increase the thickness up to, maybe 7 point, and the crossbar. Oops. Let me select the crossbar here, and maybe that one goes back down to 3 point, if that's the style that I was going for. Something like that. The F is similar to the E. So I could actually take the E here. I'll select it. I'll go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste. That creates a copy of this. And I could drop that copy here. Now in this scenario, I like the E, but I need to get rid of this bottom piece. So if I come back into my direct selection tool, I have a couple options, and I want to show you how this works. So I'm zooming in here. So there are control points that define this curve. I have a point here that defines where that corner is. I have a control point here that defines the end of that line. If I use my direct select tool and I select this endpoint right there, and I press the delete key, it's going to delete this anchor point, which consequently deletes the line that's attached to the anchor point to wherever the next anchor point would be. So if I have this selected and I press the delete key, it's going to get rid of that whole line segment and stop at the next control point or anchor point there. Sometimes it's easier for people to see it using the control point itself. I could start with this control point here. I can come up to my options bar at the top here, and one of the options shows a little scissors with 2 points. It says cut path at selected anchor points. So I have that point selected. I could cut my path, and when I do that, it separates this segment of line from that segment of line. So I could do it either way. I can split at that anchor point so that I end up with 2 pieces and then ultimately delete this line, or I could delete the anchor point at the end, which then deletes the line segment that's attached to it. Let me press Control minus, and now I have the F. So let's come back over here. I'm going to do the D next. So in the D scenario, I'll come back to my pen tool. I'll start with the back of the D, so I'll come straight down to create that part of the D. And now the D probably has a little bit of a straight segment here at the bottom. So I can come over with that straight segment maybe to there. But the next part of the D has a curve. So if I want there to be a curve, right, I don't want to just click and create that. That's not the shape I'm after. I want to create an arc here. So what I'll do, instead of just single clicking, as I've been doing to create all the rest of the shapes, I'm going to click and hold. And when I click and hold on my mouse, I can then drag out a tangent line. That tangent line then controls the curvature of this line. So I could choose how much curvature I want by how far this line extends. So I could even have it go dip down, for example. So there's a happy medium point where it looks like it belongs. It happens to be right about there. This then comes up and creates that part of the arc. As I finish the arc, I would come back over to there. So that creates that part of the D, and then I come back and close my shape right there. Now, this takes practice to get right and to be able to create that curve. So be patient and practice with it. I'm going to move over to the B next. So in the B, I'll go to the pen tool. Same thing, I'll start and I'll draw my backbone there. I'll come over a little bit. Now the B is going to have 2 humps. So in this scenario, I'll pick where I want the first hump to be. And in that scenario, I want about halfway. So if I want it to end here, I'm going to pick about halfway, which is there, and go out about there. I'll click and hold to create my tangent line, decide what looks right. It's about there. And I'll come back to right about there. That creates this part of the B. I can then finish off by coming over and connecting to right. Sorry. Nope, it doesn't want me. I'm going to have to just get close to that point. I'll end by pressing the escape key or going back to the black selection arrow. I'll come back to the pen tool, and this time I want to start up here at the top. Now to start from a line or from a control point where I already have a control point, with the pen tool, as I hover over that control point, my cursor is going to change to have a little slash next to it. You see that little slash? That means continue on from this control point. So there you go. Continue on from that control point. I'm going to come over a bit, maybe there. I'm going to click and hold and drag to create my tangent line. It's about like that. And I'm going to finish it by coming down right about there. This is going to take a little bit of touch-up, so I'll use my direct selection tool to do my touch-up. First thing I'll do is I'll take this control point and bring it over to the line itself. I'll take this control point here and bring it down so that it meets up with the rest of my B. And I may find like this looks a little bit lumpy, so I may have to adjust this point a little bit after the fact to get that curvature right. You can always select a control point and adjust the curvature afterward to create whatever curve it is that you want. So in that scenario, I've gone ahead, let me control minus, and I've created that B letter form. So the C letter form is more complicated because it's a continuous kind of circle. The key here is you start at one point, and then what people frequently do is they start to try to create too many curves, and they end up with a lumpy looking C, like that. The key is really as few curves as possible to create that, that C. So I might come here right to the top, drag my tangent line, come right to the middle, right about there, drag my tangent line, come right down to the bottom, drag my tangent line, and come back up to the point where I stop. So as few points as possible. And then I would come back in and I would make some edits. So this needs to come down a little bit more. That one might need to grow a little bit there. Let's grow that one out. Let's grow this one up just a bit. Maybe that was too much. And eventually you can get to where it's like, okay, that's not a bad looking C. Now for some people this isn't good enough. It's not accurate enough. It doesn't quite look right. So in that scenario, we can actually take this a step further. Instead of using the pen tool here, we will use, instead of a rectangle, we will use an ellipse tool. So I can start with the ellipse tool. And with the ellipse tool, I can draw an oval that is the approximate size of the C that I'm after. Now obviously I have part of the line segment here that I don't want. So I want to be able to get rid of parts of this line segment. And I can do that by clicking on the pen tool. And I can be specific and come here to the Add Anchor Point tool, or I can just work with the pen tool, and when I hover over the line, it's going to give me that plus, which is Add an Anchor Point. Either way, I can end up creating an anchor point. So it's up to you whether you want to go to the actual Add Anchor Point tool or not. And what I'm going to choose is the point where I want this oval to stop. So I want the oval to stop right here. And when I click on it, I get a control point right there. It didn't alter the shape at all. It just gave me an extra control point. Same thing here. I'm going to come to the bottom, and I'm going to say, OK, I want my C to stop right about there. So I've given myself those two control points. Now, just as I said before, if I select a control point and I delete it, it's going to delete the 2 points that are, or the 2 segments of lines that are attached to that control point up to wherever the next control points are. So I can click this point right here in the middle, press the delete key, it deletes that control point and gives me a C that ends at the top and at the bottom. Does that make sense? I'm going to do it again when I create the G. That's next. Okay? So let me do it again. Come over here to the G. Same thing, I'll start with the ellipse tool. And I'll go ahead and create my ellipse. Maybe like that. I did just realize that I have a fill color. I have a white fill color right now, so that all of my shapes actually, I'll change it to red just so you can see it, they're all filled with a color. I probably want to change that fill color to be nothing, so it's actually transparent. So some of you may have already discovered that. OK, so I want to break apart this oval so that I can end up creating the G segment. So I'll start with my Add Anchor Point tool, and I'll pick the top of the G, right about there, and I'll pick the point at the bottom where I want the G to come over. Now I have a choice. I could come over here and I could go straight up and over, or I could continue out and go over that way. It just depends on the letter form that you're trying to create. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it right about here, and I'll end up going up and over. So I have a control point here, or an anchor point there. I have a control point here. I'm going to use my direct select tool, the white arrow, select the point that's in the middle of those 2 points, right here, and I'll press the delete key. And that causes that line segment to go away. I'll come back to my regular pen tool. I'll hover over the end of this. That gives me the slash next to my pen tool. That means continue on with my line segment. I'll go straight up, and I'll go over. I can always hold down Shift to make sure I'm staying horizontal there. And I've then created my G. H is super easy. Not going to worry about that. Right? The rest of these are relatively simple. You can keep moving on here. O obviously would be a great opportunity to use an ellipse. The P and the Q. P is like a B. We would start with the pen tool at the bottom here. We'd go straight up. We'd come over just a bit. Click and hold to create my tangent line. I'm going to end it right there, and I would come back there. Let me use my direct select, my white arrow, and I'll pull that over till it matches. So it's very much like the B. Then we get to the S. So the S is always a challenge. So drawing the S from scratch takes some work, takes some practice in where those points end up being placed. I would start at the top here. I would create a point right at the top, right about there. I'd come down, create a second point on this side to control the back side of the S. It's right about there. A third point right in kind of the middle of the S. A fourth point right here to create the bottom loop. I'd come back there to create the bottom, and then I'd choose where I wanted that point to end. That's the hardest shape that you're going to draw. There's a lot of control points to work with that. Chances are it's going to take a little touch-up afterward. Remember, you can always adjust these control point lines to get the S and the arc the way that you want it so that it's nice and smooth. The alternative to that would be to start with a couple of ellipses. So I could start with one ellipse here, and I could start with a slightly larger ellipse underneath it. Maybe like that. It wouldn't hurt to use the Align tool here. So I could take these two shapes. I could go into the Align tool. I think it's under Window and then Align. And I can make sure that they're aligned to the center so they're perfectly in line with each other. Then I need to break apart this shape. So I'll go back to my pen tool, add anchor points. I want it to break here. And I don't want to put a point other than the point that's already there at the bottom, the quadrant. So then I could come back with my direct select tool, and I could delete that point, and I'd end up with this part of the arc. I then need to control where the end of the S happens. So we could come back, and I could end it, say, there. Use my direct select to pick this point. I can delete those two segments, like that. Now, these two segments are two actual individual segments. So let me pull this. Oops, sorry. Let me pull this apart. Nope. Stop. So you can see it. Two different segments there. If I want these two to become one, I need to select, using the direct select tool here, both endpoints. So I've selected there and there. It doesn't matter if these are on top of each other. You would still select both endpoints. I'll show you that in just a second. Once you have those two, you can come up to your ribbon, and there's a tool next to where it is break at anchor point. This time it's connect selected endpoints. If you click that tool, it will connect them together into one continuous curve. So if I come back for a second to where these were together, I'm going to change the endpoint style so hopefully you can see these two a little bit easier. Now it's still not giving me an an ability for you to see it. I'm going to select both of those endpoints. So I'll drag a box over both endpoints. It's selecting both, but they're on top of each other. They're not connected. They're just on top of each other. And with both of those selected, I can then come up and join those together, and this becomes one continuous curve. So it's just another strategy for creating the S. You may find that you create the S, but you really need some modifications, like this might need to, after you've created it, might need to tip down. Oops. So in this scenario, it's keeping that as a corner. I can actually convert this into a smooth shape right up here under anchor points. I could say convert to smooth, and then I can adjust it, and it will stay smooth through there, just the corner option. I can illustrate that a little bit better with just 2 line segments. So for our purposes, I have this, let's say. If I take this point right there, I can actually convert that into a smooth point. Hold on a second. Is it already? I think, yeah, when I created it, I made a mistake. Hold on. There it is. I accidentally clicked and held at that point. If I select this point, I can convert that point to be smooth, to be an arc, or I can convert it to be an angle. So I have the ability after the fact to change it. So even if you were drawing that first shape, let's say it was a B or a D. Let me do a D. And I drew initially that shape for a D. I could always come back with my direct select tool, select this point, and convert it into an arc. In which case I can then drag the handles here to control what that D were to look like. So even if it starts off angular, you can always make it smooth after the fact. So once you're done with the capital letters, you also have numbers to do up here if you want to. When all of that's done, you can go back to your layers menu here. You can turn off the font page 1. You can turn off the page 1. You can turn on the page 2, and you can turn off the turn on the font page 2. Select it so that font page 2 is selected, and then continue on with the lowercase letters and the ends of the capital letters. So again, today is all about practice. It's about getting used to the pen tool, getting comfortable with the pen tool, because long term you're going to want to be able to draw cleanly with the pen tool. We'll talk a lot about adding annotations and doing collage work and knowing how to use the pen tool, doing architectural diagrams, that kind of stuff. Having a good grasp of the pen tool is very important for that. So you'll have the rest of the time today to work and to understand and to practice the pen tool. I actually used to devote 2 whole class days to this, so you had 2 days to go through it. We don't have time. We don't have that luxury because they changed the semester, so it's a shorter semester. So you have to cram all of this into 1 day, and we'll keep going from there. I believe next class we're going to do logos. So having a good grasp of the pen tool continues next class, being able to do that. So we'll go through that when it comes. Any questions? No? If you run into anything, let me know, and I'm happy to help you.